So good afternoon. Here it is, Sunday afternoon, and I'm doing one of my body talk series. This one is on the tongue. I do want to give you the heads up, though, that I'm also been, um, I did a podcast with the people from Natural Awakenings magazine, and if you go to their website, it should be up in the next week. And Natural Awakenings have asked me to do a once a month Facebook Live, just a little question and answer thing for like 10 minutes. So I will post when that happens. It's going to be the last or the fourth Saturday of the month at 3 o'clock. And I've been asked to change this live presentation to 3 o'clock on the second Saturday of the month. So I apologize that it's been moving around a little bit, but we'll do our best. You can always watch it after I've done it. Don't always have to come online with me. So this little presentation, and I promise you it's probably going to be a little one, is about the tongue. And part of that's because, you know, how much can you say about the tongue? So I'll say the things and share the things that I know. What I will do is talk about the anatomy just a little bit first. I did some reading on the tongue before we do this. I do have a picture of the tongue. So one of the deals is here's the tongue, obviously from a sort of a top view. This part of the tongue in the back is called the root. And here's the part that I thought was super interesting, and I'll show you a picture of this, is that the root of the tongue actually attaches into your jawbone, your mandible here, and where it also attaches is onto this floating hyoid. So it actually has attachments in the root, into your neck, and directly into your jaw. I did not know that. I thought it was freestanding in a way, but what it turns out is that it's more fixed in the root. So the root is definitely more fixed. And then we have the body of the tongue, which is the middle of the tongue, which is not fixed and definitely mobile. And of course, we have the tip of the tongue, which is extremely mobile, So one of the deals is the tongue is a group of muscles. You know, I thought the tongue was one big thick muscle, but it's not. It's actually a bunch of the tongue is a bunch of little muscles that are all connected together. I thought that was super interesting, really, and because I originally thought it was one thick muscle. And somewhere many years ago, I had heard that the tongue was the biggest muscle in the body. I don't know if that's true, but it's definitely thick. I'm going to show you a picture of it from the side in just a second, and you'll see, wow, that is a pretty thick muscle. So don't forget that this is the root, and the root of the tongue is attached to your jaw and to the hyoid bone here that floats underneath the jaw. So this part is fixed. This is the body, and this is the tip. The body is mobile, and the tip is even more mobile. But we'll talk about issues with mobility in just a little teeny bit. Now, the tongue is covered in papillae, which are like the little bumps. And I thought that the bumps were actually the taste buds. But as I was reading, there's different kinds of papillae in different kinds of shapes on the tongue. You know, I actually typed it up, but I'm not going to get into that with you why. I mean, so you know that there's these little bumps all over. And some of the papillae actually have, like in the small intestine, where you have the villi, which are little hair-like things, the papillae stick up, and then on some of them, there's taste buds all around on the papillae, which I thought was really super interesting. And there's different taste buds in different parts of the tongue, and they taste different things, some for sweet, some for, whatever, salty. But the also interesting thing is that as a baby, most of your taste buds, I think it's like 65% of your taste buds are all for sweet, which is mother's milk is very sweet. So nature has it so that the baby will really want to drink mother's milk because it's sweet and that's what feels good or tastes good on the tongue. How about that? So that's a super interesting piece. Let me show you the picture, of the tongue from the side view. Sorry about that. So look at the size of this tongue. I mean, look at the size of that in the cavity here. The tongue is huge. This is the hard palate above the tongue. This is the hard palate, and then you get into the soft palate here in the back. Look at you here, these are all dealing with nasal stuff. This is all nasal stuff, and I want you to know that if I feel like I've got full, nasal cavities, which doesn't happen very often, but when I feel like I do, what I actually do, I learned this from, I think it was the, I don't know, could have been the Rolf Institute, is I actually go into and press on this where the soft palate is, and that will release the sinuses because the sinuses are sitting right above, right above that tongue in the soft palate. So right behind the hard palate. So I actually do it that way, which I think is kind of interesting. So we have all of this. So the functions of the tongue are actually for breathing. It's part of breathing, part of taste, part of speech, and actually part of eating. And actually there is a part of the tongue that is also, I don't know, wow, that just went right out of my head. The next part I was going to say. That's actually kind of funny. Oh my gosh. So one of the deals is, I want to talk about this, is that when there's tension in the tongue, the tongue can actually restrict the breathing. So we are supposed to be actually nose breathers and not mouth breathers. And this is not a post about or a video about breathing, but we have to talk about it here because the tongue plays a role in this. So one of the deals is that if I'm breathing through my nose, that allows the mouth to be closed and the lower jaw will come a little teeny bit more forward and the tongue will just sit down. But if I'm a mouth breather, for some reason, because there can be several reasons why you become a mouth breather, positioning wise, a mouth breather. And when you're a mouth breather, actually, what happens is your tongue shifts backwards and it can even cause airway issues. So your tongue is really inappropriately sitting for just the restful act of breathing. The other thing about mouth breathing is that the body mouth breathing is more about that sort of need to breathe like, or, in that frame. So when you're a mouth breather, you're signaling kind of a fight or flight response in the body as well. Just thought I'd share that little piece with you. Okay. So in sleep, the tongue often shifts backwards. So while you're sleeping, the tongue can shift backwards and actually cause problems. The more you can have snoring and sleep apnea, the more overweight you are for some reason, the more the tongue actually obstructs those airways. So it's kind of a crazy thing there, but it's true. So let's see what else I say. So, okay. So here's the deal. I don't know if I'm answering the questions. I'm going to talk about all the things that go on with the tongue itself. All right. So I also want you to know that if you have forward head posture, like from a car accident, I have a little bit forward head posture. You have let me put this down. I apologize. Is you have the neck and you have the head, and this is the front of the head over here, the front of the face. And one thing is, when I do this, this creates a tension through this entire part of the back of the throat, okay, of where the end of the root of the tongue is and the back of the throat. So you can have issues with swallowing if you've got some kind of tensional patterns that are happening with head position on neck. It's going to echo and definitely echo into the tongue. I mean, ask yourself, people who are watching right now, ask yourself to really take a breath and ask yourself to relax your tongue and see if you feel like your tongue then relaxes and sits down further into the floor of your mouth. I know when I do it, it's kind of great actually, and I get, because I just sit with tongue tension after my car accident. I've had tongue tension ever since that. So, so there's that. So there's that part of the tension. Other things that go on with the tongue is also things like if somebody has a white coating on their tongue. This is candida. This is an overgrowth of yeast going on with the tongue. And it is more common than you actually realize. And when someone loses their sense of taste, now I only know this because I had a client who had lost his sense of taste and had not had it for years. And the weird thing is that I decided to open all the bones inside of his head. Maybe that would help, I didn't know. And I worked down the canal, not by sticking my finger in, but there's a way to work down the canal inside the bone, the temporal bone, and in it, there's something called the seventh cranial nerve, the facial nerve. And that actually, you can lose your sense of taste if there's something going on with that. So that's like my first line now. When I have a client come in who actually has lost their sense of taste, I'm going to come in and try to relieve the seventh cranial nerve. And then you have to give them a little bit of time and see if it actually comes back and that sense of taste comes back. Now, there's also something called, and I wrote this down, so there's something called macroglossia. Macroglossia. Now here's the deal, guys. All that means is big tongue, right? But here's the situation on the big tongue part, is that when you have a tongue that feels too big for your mouth or won't sit into your teeth, let me grab this other picture, or won't sit into your teeth, right? Then what can happen is that that is actually an overactive spleen. Now your spleen is part of your immune system. Your spleen lives on your left side at the lower part of your rib cage, tucked into your respiratory diaphragm. So your spleen is part of your immune system, right? It's making white and red blood cells and stuff like that. But if my tongue, there's two things that can show that the spleen is overacting. One is that the tongue doesn't fit, and number two is if I have scallops. Look at the scallops all around the edge of the tongue. The scallops around the edge of the tongue show you that your spleen is way overworking. So if your spleen is overworking and is coming out in your tongue, I would make a bet, I can't say this for sure, is that you're eating foods that are creating inflammation in the body. If you're eating things that are creating inflammation, then what happens is the spleen overworks, because inflammation is always the spleen. Well, it's not always the spleen. Inflammation triggers the spleen to be overworking, right? Because there's an inflammatory situation. Now, that you can have an inflammatory situation, whether it's like I hurt my knee or I eat foods that are creating inflammation. It reads it that there's inflammation and it has to make white blood cells. When the inflammation just keeps going and going, then what happens is that it'll just keep the spleen has to keep working and working and working. And that's an overactive spleen, which can end up with things like the large tongue, a tongue that's big, and also the scallops on the side. The other thing that can happen is when you have allergies to different foods, those little papillae can actually get inflamed and they get sore. So that would mean that you're sensitive to something you're eating. It could happen not just with things like sour foods like lemons or something. You could have it be with chocolate or salt or any number of things. But if you start to notice that, you want to start honing down on what it is that you're eating, or that you're eating, so that I'm so sorry, I apologize, I'm not doing well here today. Anyway, that you're eating that's kind of creating an inflammation in those little bumps that are all over the tongue. So let's talk about a couple of other things. So the big thing about tongues, the big thing about tongues is the fact that down the center of the tongue, I'll show it on this picture. Down the center of the tongue, you can see that there's a line which creates the left and right side of the tongue. There's a left and right side, and this is a groove. This is the groove. But in the groove, under the groove, is a septum. Okay, there's a septum that we all know is under the tongue. Now we have all these people with tongue ties, babies and adults who have tongue tie. And the deal is that, so here we have a normal tongue. I'm going to kind of show you. Here we have this normal tongue that can lift up and actually go up. The tip is very mobile. The body is mobile on the tongue, and that's normal. So we can have these tongue ties, which is getting more and more and more common, and I'll tell you why, that we can have these tongue ties. So you can have an underneath the tongue, a moderate tie that still lets the tongue lift some, and you can have a severe one where it's tied and it doesn't let the tongue lift at all. I also have another picture that actually shows you. Okay, so what it shows you is this is normal, where the tongue can lift. Notice this is actually creates like a V in the tongue. And here it pulls so hard that it pulls in, excuse me, that it pulls the tongue into a heart shaped, okay? So many people are finding these days, are finding that their babies can't latch because of these tongue ties. So there's so many tongue ties that that many dentists as well as doctors are getting the equipment, the laser and so forth, in order to work on the tongue ties. But I also want you to know that in the center, the septum, or the piece that runs in the membrane that runs lengthwise down the tongue, okay, can also be in a tie. You don't just have them here under the tongue in the front. You can also have a lip tie just underneath the lip, but you can also have a tie that is like a tether, like a drawstring that draws right through the middle of the tongue. So don't be, it's like sometimes I apologize, parents will have the baby's tongue tie released under the tongue, later to find out that the tie is more even lengthwise in the tongue as well. It really makes it's more often than you think that is going on. So what is the deal about that? Well, here's the story from my viewpoint. Doctors may have another idea, but from my education and years of working. So genetically, we have a gene called I'm gonna like space right here, is the MTFR3 gene. And what's happening is this gene, or these genes, actually they deal with the B vitamins, all those B vitamins, B1, B6, all the B vitamins, and it's the MTFR3 gene is to turn things on so that things can process. And what happens is when a woman carries that gene that's either half working or not working, which is getting more and more and more common. It's getting more and more and more and more common. I can't even begin to tell you how common it is now. They're saying upwards between 40 and 50% of the population does not do what's called methylate, which is what that MTFR3 gene actually does. It's a methylation process, but there's many pathways in the methylation. So that what happens is, here's the weird, crazy part, is that you get midline defects on your baby. So midline defects can be any of the ties, lip, tongue, anywhere in the tongue. You can get it with a midline defect where they have an umbilical hernia, like the belly button, doesn't grow closed. It's an umbilical hernia. Or your pyloric valve, which is the valve at the bottom of your stomach. It's at the end of your stomach where it goes into the small intestine. Then, well, I've had pyloric stenosis. I've had all sorts of things. I've seen many children that have had to have surgeries in order to open that, or this, it gets kind of herniated there, and so they've had to have surgical intervention. I'm telling you that more and more and more people, we're getting, I apologize to say this, but we're getting genetically weaker with every generation for many reasons that I won't go into here, but there's many reasons why each generation is getting more sensitive and having more stuff. So we, if you're a mom or if you're going to be a mom and everything, it would be good for you to know if you need to get the help, the methylation help while you're pregnant, so that you don't end up with or have a baby that has some kind of tongue tie and tie issues. Now, the thing about the tongue ties, and we'll morph into the usage of the tongue, is that when the tongue is tied, of course, it is very difficult to latch and suck correctly with the mom. And part of mom's letdown of her milk is also by the way the baby's tongue interacts on the mom. So there's a certain sort of thing it's supposed to do that really helps the mom's milk actually drop down. So when the baby is tied or they have other you know, things going on, there can be an issue with having mother's milk actually drop in. Or, and they do it, and you know what the funny thing is that they usually blame the mom. Like I'll talk to these moms and ask if they've breastfed their baby or were they breastfed, and you hear the answer of, well, my mother's milk didn't come in, or my mother didn't have enough milk. And I wonder how much of that is truly mom's side and how much of it is actually baby's tongue side, because that is so common. And the other thing is babies often have a jaw that's misaligned, and with the misalignment of the jaw is often a latching problem, or a palate that's too high or too low creates a latching problem. So, because I always put my finger in a baby's, when I'm working on these babies, especially newborns, I put my finger in their mouth. Of course, it's clean, and to feel what the suck feels like. And I'll know what it is and where it is that's doing it once I can feel that. So it's a kind of an interesting deal. Okay, so one thing I do want to say, another little piece that I want to say, and I want to talk about tongue thrusting. So from my point of view, of course, which is all I can talk about is my point of view, tongue thrusting is also kind of interesting. And I didn't bring one of my skulls home. I should have done that. Is that, we have all sorts of cranial bones, above the palate. We have a bone that's at the back of the eye and the frontal, and we have a bone that looks like a sail above the palate. And what happens is that when we're going through the birth canal, we can get compressed. We can get compressed through here. So I always kind of look at thumb sucking and tongue thrusting as the unconscious way the baby is actually trying to push that back up, because it's super common to actually get that pushed down through the birthing process. So that tongue thrusting often comes from a compression or a torquing into the bones, and it's this unconscious way of trying to, either with the thumb or with the tongue, pushing in order to get that free. Here's my wondering. So I know that Down syndrome is a genetic thing. There's something on one of the genes and stuff, or a few, I don't know. I have not researched that at all. But I wonder about their tongue thrusting, because when I look at the profile of a Down syndrome person, is that they are very sloped. They're very sloped and very pushed down here. And I just wonder, really, I mean, totally, I'd do the experiment if I could, is that if you lifted the bones and actually opened up the palate, would they stop thrusting? That would be a really interesting question to me. But for me, all the thrusting of the tongue has a lot to do with a bony compression that's happening that's being trying to be resolved. So anyway, that's my story. I don't have much else to say about the tongue. It is something that you can work sort of in a body work way. There's one or two ways to sort of do it, and it's not something that gets done very often, but every once in a while I do, especially when someone has swallowing issues. So I appreciate everybody. I'm sorry I did an hour presentation just before this, and so I'm a little tired, and I apologize for my not coming straight at you, but I appreciate you. Hey, next time I do the body talk, it'll be all about sort of trauma and the auto-regulating system. So I look forward to seeing you guys then. Hey, take care.